and good evening, everyone. Um, Welcome to you all. I think, over 80 of you who are joining us for this webinar this evening. We're calling St. Mark's Reads Farley. We've come together this evening on May the 12th. Hard to believe, 100 years ago.
This is his 100th birthday today.
And just down the road in Belleville, where Farley was born, Farley Mowat, who gave us Farley McGill Mowat, as he was born,
That's his middle name.
who has given us a lifetime of stories and activism, controversy, um, and yes, companionship along the way.
For me, for sure.
I know that's. So welcome to you all. My name is William Roberts, and as the priest and pastor here at St. Mark's, I never had the pleasure of meeting Farley, but I must say last August when I came to Port Hope with my wife Eileen, one of the first people we did meet was Claire Mowat, who is not only a devoted parishioner here and a dear neighbor up the street, but I think one of the most unpretentious and fun people I've ever met.
Well, thank you.
Claire Mowat.
Thank you very much.
And herself, as you must know, is an author of 7 books.
No, 6.
6 books.
I'm working on the 7th. Right?
Okay. Thanks to McClellan Stewart.
Yes.
And Key Porter.
Yes.
And the Travels with Farley book. So much fun.
Yes.
And is currently at her typewriter writing the 7th one that she's not saying too much about, right?
Oh, no. I never talk about work in progress.
Right.
And I learned that from Farley.
Is that right?
He didn't talk about what he was doing until it was finished.
Okay. But to know it is a work in progress and you're still working at it.
Yes.
So for all of you, we've got this thing we thought that we should, there we go, have Farley join us.
Yes.
With this wonderful photo. And Claire, where did this photo come from anyway?
A tiny little lake near our home in Cape Breton Island. It's called Mill Lake. And as time went by, we changed the name to Millie Lake because our dog Millie loved to go paddling in the canoe.
And is it who actually took this picture?
I did.
You took the picture?
Yeah, I was in the bow
In the
of
bow.
canoe, Farley in the stern.
Yeah.
And we did have a dog in the middle, but that photo
can't
has
quite see the
been
dog.
sliced.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got Farley with us tonight behind us as well.
In
So,
spirit, yes.
So Claire, we're here tonight on this Wednesday night, but it's a day ahead of our normal Thursday 4 o'clock walk around town. During the lockdown, everything, Claire and I spend 4 o'clock on Thursday, and it was a couple of months ago when I said, so what are we doing for Farley's 100th birthday celebration on May 12th? And we chatted, and so I threw out the suggestion, well, why don't we get 5 of our wonderful readers from St. Mark's? And if you choose 5 readings, and we'll have a reading session and have some excerpts and some highlights from Farley's readings and have some fun with it at St. Mark's. And so we set to work to do that. And then, as we all know, I mean, a month ago with this COVID and this pandemic, we had the word that everything's further locked down and we can't get more than 10 together. So I said, well, let's go online and do it with the Zoom way, which Claire had never done before, and I hadn't either. But it was great because now it has the advantage of having people from across Canada joining us tonight, over 80 of you joining us this evening. So thanks for coming on, all of you family and friends of Farley and Claire. You may know that on the chat button, you can sort of say hello to us from wherever you are. I see that Susan Graham's there, and so others of you who might want to just say hello in the chat. We can't see you, and so it's a bit odd, but we'd like to know who's where and where people are from. So do take advantage of that to say hello. But we also want to acknowledge that a dear friend of Farley and Claire's, the Right Honorable Ed Schreier, former Premier of Manitoba, Governor General of Canada, and spent lots of times with you and Farley, and his dear wife, Lily, are with us here tonight from their home in Winnipeg.
In Winnipeg.
So welcome to Ed and Lily. And we have a bunch of folks on the East Coast, from Nova Scotia, Newfoundland even,
We lived in a lot of
a
places
lot of places.
and luckily made a lot of friends.
So as well as the East Coast, on the West Coast, we've got this woman named Elizabeth May.
A longtime friend.
Elizabeth May. So welcome to Elizabeth, Member of Parliament for Saanich and the Islands, and again, a longtime friend of Claire and Farley's. And by the way, Elizabeth, congratulations to you on winning an honorary doctorate from Montreal Diocesan Theological College just 2 weeks ago. So Elizabeth May, now there's a priest in the diocese here named Elizabeth Green, and I hope she doesn't get confused, Elizabeth Green with Elizabeth May, but welcome to you, Elizabeth, and to all of you on the West Coast. So I also just want to acknowledge and thank Ron Tuttle, who's with the Port Hope Rotary Club,
Yes.
with John Mowat,
Mm-hmm.
who also spent some time putting this week together. So we know many of them from the Rotary Club are online with us. And it was terrific that the town of Port Hope, I think with Rotary and others, decided to rename, what's it called, East Side Park.
Well, the east side of the downtown park
Right.
will soon be called the Farley Mowat Park.
Right.
And I'm very pleased about that.
And with the roof house boat,
The
the boathouse roof.
boathouse.
Roof.
No, the roof.
Roof house, I had it right, is there.
It's a statue in the park. We should
Right.
make it clear to people who haven't seen it.
But it's going to be named the Farley Mowat Park, and we kidded that it's right across from the new brewery in town.
Yes.
too, so
That's very handy.
that's right. Plus that the Rotary Club has put this writing competition out for the 3 categories from kindergarten to grade 8, elementary, and then grade 9 to 12, and then adults, 3 divisions for people to write a story about Canada's North.
Mhm.
So thanks to the Rotary Club for doing that with Furby Books.
Yeah,
They're going to be announcing the winner. They get $100 each of the different categories.
it's a great idea.
They're going to be in honor of Farley writing, young writers and other writers about Canada's North, and that's going to be announced on Friday afternoon. So quite a week here. And again, thank you all for joining with us. But before we begin with the readings, I'm sure Farley, who, as I've seen and heard, was so touched by the natural world, as we open ourselves to the supernatural world, would want us to respectfully acknowledge our First Nations people.
Oh, indeed.
And so here in Port Hope, we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the sacred territory, traditional territory of the Michi, the Sagig, and the Anishabig people. And we offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care and their teachings of the earth and of our relations. And we honor them by being here together tonight, acknowledging that they have gone here before. So again, welcome to you all. I see all kinds of wonderful chats coming in from people. So let's begin. And I wanted Claire first to, if you could make sure everyone sees you and can hear you. But it was quite a task, I think, out of Farley's, what did we say, 42 books,
42 books.
26 languages, 17 million sold. What the process was to select 5 excerpts from the great canon of Farley Mowat's subjective nonfiction works. So describe a bit.
I think it's fair to say that I know his work better than anybody else in the world, because in the beginning I typed his books when we first got together. I edited, I proofread. I know his work very, very well. There are a couple of other people. Mary Talbot, his longtime associate, knows his work too, and so does Susan Renouf. But when it comes right down to choosing, I didn't have a problem with it.
Okay, good.
Farley's written serious books and he's written funny books. So tonight we have, the start of it is with 2 serious books. Then there are 2 amusing and funny books, one about the wolf, one about the boat. And the concluding selection, which I'm asking you to read, is, I always say it's more like a sermon. Not the kind you read in the church, but it talks about how we should save the planet and all we've been doing such terrible things to it for so long. So that will be the final reading. But the first one begins at the beginning of his career.
All right, so tell us that. Please, that Phil Redford is going to join us from his home, a place north of the 401 there. But tell us why you chose this as the first one from one of his first books.
Well, it is the first one. People of the Deer was published in 1951 in Canada, and I think it was 1952 in the United States. And it really brought attention to Canada's north. Up to then, I think we all kind of knew that there was a lot of land up there and some people in it, but we didn't know very much about it. And I think he had a sense of mission that he wanted people to know what we had up there, how big it was and expansive and everything else, and that there were people living there, and they'd been there for at least 1,000 years. We used to call them Eskimos. We now call them Inuit. And there are many variations of people living in different kinds of villages. But what he did discover, he went up there to study wolves. He wanted to be a biologist first. But he did discover a band of people totally abandoned. They'd been moved from one place to another and abandoned, and they were starving and suffering. And he certainly brought a lot of attention on those people. And the government did finally move them.
Yeah, it went into the House of Commons even for a debate.
It did, yes. It was a big issue. So that focused a great deal of attention on his first book, People of the Deer.
Wonderful. So Phil Redford, thank you for taking this excerpt and for reading it for us. Now, I've heard from some in the chat box that some people can't quite hear. I'm hoping everyone can hear clearly. We've got the volume cranked up, but anyway, over to you, Phil. So everyone, if you just wherever you are, just let your mind focus on the words of Farley Mowat, People of the Deer, as read by Phil Redford.
Thank you so much, Father William, and thank you, Claire. I am so honored to be able to give this reading from one of my favorite works. After 32 years of teaching, I had such a pleasure reading Farley's books. Owls in the Family, Lost in the Barrens, of course now called Two Against the North, and so many others to children along the way. And I must say that it is in fact Farley who spurred my loins to get a paddle, get in a canoe, and ply the rivers of the north. So I have had the pleasure of going out to the bay, the Big Bay, James Bay, and other bays, plowing those rivers, remembering the joy that I had trying to pretend to be an adventurer like Farley. So I am very, very honored to read from People of the Deer. An excerpt from Chapter 1, The Why and Wherefore. In the spring of 1935, when I was an undersized youth of 15, I made my first journey into Arctic lands under the tutelage of a great uncle who was an amateur but fanatical student of birds. My Uncle Frank's consuming interest in wild things had been perpetuated in me, for from the age of 6, I too had been passionately interested in all the animals that haunted the rolling prairies near my home in Saskatoon. Our house in that western city had for long years been shared with pet skunks, coyotes, crows, gophers, and rattlesnakes of uncertain disposition. Even my human friends were chosen almost exclusively from the half-wild and suitably ragged children at the Dundurn Indian Reserve. For I shared with those sons of nomads a strange devotion to the illusory freedom of the broad prairie plains. That restless longing to find affinity with primordial things was a legacy from my father, but it took shape and gained direction under the influence of Great Uncle Frank. He, at my mother's request, undertook to take me with him on one of his yearly pilgrimages to the ancient tundras of the Arctic, where we were to spend a summer among the curious northern birds whose very names were mystery in my ears, and whose way of life were old before ours were begun. In the first week of May 1935, the meadowlarks brought spring to Saskatoon, and Uncle Frank was close behind. Tall, gaunt, and weather-worn, he was still filled with the indestructible energy which had carried him through arduous years of struggle with the tough sod of an Alberta wheat farm. He had acquitted himself well in that long battle against hail and blight, and now in his late 60s, he was able to indulge his lifelong hobby. And so each new spring saw him voyaging to some distant place to watch birds whose lives he longed to know and understand. To my young eyes, Uncle Frank was a somewhat dusty Olympian, and beside him I felt as insignificant as a blade of twitchgrass. Yet, when he looked down upon me from his great spare height, he seemed to be vaguely satisfied with what he saw. And so, on the day following his arrival at Saskatoon, we two set off together for Winnipeg, the central gateway to the Arctic lands. It was the beginning of an odyssey. From Winnipeg, the railroad sweeps westward in a wide curve over the flat, rich wheatlands, which are the bed of ancient Lake Agassiz, a mighty lake that died with the last glacier. Then the steel bends northward, and in time the train passes the flat farmlands and little villages go by, each marked by the bulge of an Orthodox steeple and the square monument of a grain elevator. Slowly, the forests extended their rough fingers into the black soil of the farms until the fingers close slightly. The prairies are gone, and only the matted disorder of forests remains. The train runs more cautiously now, for it is entering a land that is hostile to strangers. It makes its way northward through the low forests, which are the home of the Cree Indians. And at last it draws up with gusty relief at the frontier town of the Pas. Here, in a decaying cluster of buildings, the Winnipeg train turns gratefully back to the south and hurries to leave behind it the anonymous tangle of forest and muskegs. But the Pas, that seedy settlement which has been left behind to wither and rot as the frontier has pushed north, is not yet the end of the steel. Instead, it is the southern terminus for a cockeyed political shenanigan that is proudly known in Canada's capital as the Hudson Bay Railway, but is better known in the land where it lives as the Muskeg Express. A rebellious and contrary railway that may have an equal in the wilds of Siberia, the Muskeg Express has no relatives on this continent. It stretches northward for 500 desolate miles to the shore of Hudson Bay. It thinks nothing of running 100 miles at a time without curves and without bends to relieve the heavy-footed pace it maintains. For the most part, its roadbed is built upon blocks of ancient peat moss, and this moss in turn sits uneasily on the perpetual ice of the muskegs and the swamps, whose black depths hold the last dominions of the old vanished glaciers. The only passenger accommodation on the train was in the caboose, so Uncle Frank and I lived there for 3 days and 2 nights that the journey consumed. I amused myself by keeping track of the little white painted signboards which marked off each mile, and by counting the number of rail spikes per mile that flew out of the ties and went buzzing off through the air like bullets as the train passed along. I was grateful to the mile boards and to the spikes for the monotony of that northward journey through the unchanging and somber forests was almost unbroken by anything else. But at mile 410, something did happen. Something that was to lead me into an undreamed of world in the years which lay far ahead. Near mile 400, I had noticed that the maddening succession of stunted and half-drowned spruce trees was beginning to be pierced by long finger-like openings running down from the northwest. When I pointed them out to my Uncle Frank, he explained that these were the slim tentacles which were being thrust southward by those great Arctic plains we call the Barrens, and the presence of these fingers of the plains marked the passing of the dominion of forests. I climbed up to the high bench of the caboose cupola to have a better look at the new lands which were appearing, and I was there when the marker for mile 410 came into view, and simultaneously the rusty whistle of the old engine began to give tongue. It was to continue sounding for a full half hour with a reckless disregard for steam pressure. But at the first blast, I looked forward over the humped backs of the freight cars and noticed the whistle no more. A brown, flowing river had appeared and was surging out of the edge of the dying forests and plunging across and over snow-covered roadbed ahead. A broad, turbulent ribbon of brown ran out of an opening to the southeast and traced its sinuous course northwest over the snows of a land that was still completely gripped by the frosts. For this was no river of water, but a river of life. I had my binoculars to my eyes in the instant, and through the lenses I saw the steam dissolve into its myriad parts, and each part of that river was the long-legged shape of a deer. C'est la foule! The French-Canadian brakeman stood beside me, and at the sound of his words, I understood what it was I was beholding. It is the throng! Those were the words that the first of the early French explorers wrote in his journal when he beheld what is perhaps the most tremendous living spectacle that our continent knows: the almost incredible mass migration of the numberless herds of caribou, the reindeer of the Canadian North. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Wow. Really so descriptive and so powerful. Takes you right up there. Wonderful. People of the deer. Okay, so moving on to the second reading now. Claire, do you
Yes.
want to describe?
Yes.
Go ahead.
The second reading is a short story from the book called The Snow Walker. It's a collection of short pieces about snow, mostly, and the north and cold weather. And Farley didn't write a lot of short pieces. He tended to write books. And this is one book, which is a collection of short pieces. And I think the first piece, called Snow, is very evocative. And I'm looking forward to hearing it read.
And I am too, with someone who is not afraid of a microphone, who's on our local radio and is a wonderful parishioner here, Pat Bryan. Pat, you're there. You've got the text, the excerpt. Over to you, Brian.
I am here, and I must say, as a writer of much less note than Farley, I've never been very passionate about snow. Most I've written, I think, is, oh, it's bloody well snowing again. But anyhow, I felt I should do justice to this reading. Farley has written 17 paragraphs about snow. I thought this would be an appropriate dress for wearing.
Perfect.
Now, when man was still very young, he had already become aware that certain elemental forces dominated the world womb. Embedded on the shores of their warm sea, the Greeks defined these as fire and earth and air and water. But at first the Greek sphere was small and very much circumscribed, and the Greeks did not recognize the fifth elemental. Well, about 330 BC, a peripatetic Greek mathematician named Pythias made a fantastic voyage northward to Iceland and onto the Greenland Sea. Here he encountered the fifth elemental in all of its white and frigid majesty, and when he returned to the warm blue Mediterranean, he described what he had seen as best he could. His fellow countrymen concluded he must be a liar, since even their vivid imaginations could not conceive of the splendor and power inherent in this white substance that sometimes lightly cloaked the mountain homes of their high-dwelling gods. Their failure to recognize the immense power of snow was not entirely their fault, and we, who are the Greeks' inheritors, have much the same trouble comprehending its essential magnitude. Snow, which on our planet is a phoenix continually born again from its own dissolution, is also a galactic and immortal presence. In the nullity of outer space, clouds of snow crystals, immeasurably vast, drift with time, unchanged since long before our world was born, unchangeable when it will be gone. For all that the best brains of science and the sharpest of cyclopean eyes of astronomers can tell, the glittering crystals flecking the illimitable void are as one with those that settle on our hands and our faces out of the still skies of a December night. Snow is a single flake caught for an instant on a window pane, but it is also a signboard in the solar system. When astronomers peer up at Mars, they see the red planet as a monochromatic globe, except for its polar caps, from which gleaming mantles spread toward the equatorial regions. As the antelope flashes its white rump on the dun prairies, so does Mars signal to worlds beyond its with the brilliance of our common sun reflected from its plains of snow. And so does Earth. Snow is crystalline dust, tenuous among the stars, but on Earth it is, in yet another guise, the master Titan. To the south, it holds the entire continent of Antarctica in absolute thrall. To the north, it crouches heavily upon mountain ranges, and the island subcontinent of Greenland literally sags and sinks beneath its weight. For glaciers are but another guise of snow. Glaciers are born while the snow falls, fragile, soft, and almost disembodied, but falling steadily without a thawing time. Years pass, decades, centuries, and the snow falls. Now there is weight where there was none. At the surface of an undulating white waste, there seems to be no alteration, but in the frigid depths, the crystals are deformed. They change in structure, interlock with increasing intimacy, and eventually meld into black, lightless ice. There is no natural phenomenon known to us that can surpass the dispassionate power of a great glacier. The rupturing of Earth during a most appalling earthquake cannot compare with it. The raging water of the seas in their most violent moments cannot begin to match it. Air howling in the dementia of hurricanes is nothing beside it. The inner fire that blows a mountain to pieces and inundates the surrounding plains with floods of flaming lava is weak by comparison. A glacier is the macrocosmic form of snow, but in its microscopic forms, snow epitomizes ethereal beauty. It is a cliche to say that no two snowflakes are identical, but it is a fact that each single snowflake that has fallen throughout all of time and that will fall through what remains of time has been, will be, a unique creation in symmetry and form. The northern people are happy when snow lies heavy on the land. They welcome the first snow in autumn and often regret its passing in the spring. Snow is their friend. Without it, they would have perished, or almost worse, from their point of view. They would long since have been driven south to join us in our frenetic rush to wherever it is that we are bound. Somewhere on this day, the snow is falling. It may be sifting thinly on the cold sands of a desert, spreading a strange pallidity and flecking the dark upturned faces of a band of Semitic nomads. For them, it is in the nature of a miracle, and it certainly is an omen, and they are filled with awe and chilled with apprehension. It may be settling in great flakes on a calm night over a vast city, spinning cones of distorted vision in the headlights of creeping cars and covering the wounds, softening the suppurating ugliness inflicted on the earth by modern man. Children hope it will continue all night long so that no buses, streetcars, or family automobiles will be able to carry the victims off to school in the morning. But adult men and women wait impatiently, for if it does not stop soon, the snow will smother the intricate designs that have been ordained for the next day's pattern of existence. Or the snow may be slanting swiftly down across a cluster of tents, huddled below a rock ridge on the Arctic tundra. Gradually, it enfolds a pack of dogs who lie, noses thrust under bushy tails, until the snow covers them completely and they sleep warm. Inside the tents, men and women smile. Tomorrow, the snow may be deep enough and hard enough so that the tents can be abandoned, and the welcome domes of snow houses can rise again to turn winter into a time of gaiety, of songs, of leisure, and lovemaking. Somewhere, the snow is falling. Thank you. Thank you, Farley.
Well, thank you, Pat Bryan. Wow. That is so breathtaking, ethereal beauty. No two snowflakes alike. Wow. What to say?
Well, we tend to think of snow, if you're in a town, as a lot of trouble. And where's the snow plow and how do we get out of here? But Farley had a much more instinctive feeling about snow. And just as Pat has read, it's vital to people who live in the north and really vital to people all over the place. And we don't appreciate it enough.
Well, we do now.
Yeah, thank you, Pat.
Thank you so much. So for the third reading, what's this Never Cry Wolf about?
Well, Never Cry Wolf has became a very popular book, which surprised me. I remember typing it out twice and hoping that people would like it. And you know, to this day, it's been translated into 21 languages, and it portrays the wolf as a creature with almost the same sort of feelings we all have. Family gatherings and raising little children. And Farley went to the north to study the wolf. It was a government job one summer. And that is where he learned a lot about the wolf. And it has its funny moments.
Yeah,
as you
the most stew.
Yes, he did make mouse stew because his theory was that the wolf was mostly eating mice, that they weren't going around eating children and doing terrible things like fairy tales had depicted the wolf at one time. So now this was an update on the wolf and a very popular book, and I'm looking forward to hearing it read.
As we are. Gary Potter, thank you so much for taking the script and this excerpt, and Gary, who's done some good stage work, but it's kind of new for us to do the Zoom thing. So anyway, good. Thank you for taking this, and over to you, Gary. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Father William. And Claire, thank you for choosing this excerpt. It's really a lot of fun. Never Cry Wolf. My early years as a naturalist were free and fascinating. But as I entered manhood and found that my avocation must now become my vocation, the walls began to close in. The happy days of the universal scholar who was able to take a keen interest in all phases of natural history were at an end, and I was forced to recognize the unpalatable necessity of specializing if I was to succeed as a professional biologist. Nevertheless, as I began my academic training at the university, I found it difficult to choose the narrow path. The die was cast one winter's day when I received a summons from the Dominion Wildlife Service informing me that I had been hired at the munificent salary of $120 a month and that I would report to Ottawa at once. I obeyed this peremptory order with hardly more than a twitch of subdued rebelliousness, for if I had learned anything during my years at the university, it was that the scientific hierarchy requires a high standard of obedience, if not subservience, from its acolytes. 2 days later, I arrived in the windswept, gray-souled capital of Canada and found my way into the dingy labyrinth which housed the Wildlife Service. Here, I presented myself to the chief mammalogist, whom I had known as a school chum in more carefree days. But alas, he had now metamorphosed into a full-blown scientist and was so shrouded in professional dignity that it was all I could do to refrain from making him a profound abeyance. Through the next several days, I was subject to something called orientation, a process which, so far as I could see, was designed to reduce me to a malleable state of hopeless depression. At any rate, the legions of Dantesque bureaucrats whom I visited in their gloomy, formalin-smelling dens, where they spent interminable hours compiling dreary data or originating meaningless memos, did nothing to rouse in me much devotion to my new employment. As you are aware, Lieutenant Mowat, my chief began, the Canis lupus problem has become one of national importance. Within this past year alone, this department has received no less than 37 memoranda from members of the House of Commons, all expressing the deep concern of their constituents that we ought to do something about the wolf. Most of the complaints have come from such civic-minded and disinterested groups as various fish and game clubs, while members of the business community, in particular the manufacturers of some well-known brands of ammunition, have lent their weight to the support of these legitimate grievances of the voting public of this great dominion. You, Lieutenant Mowat, have been chosen for this great task. It only remains for you to go out into the field at once and tackle this work in a manner worthy of the great traditions of this department. The wolf, Lieutenant Mowat, is your problem. Although these instructions were firm in tone, they were rather lacking in specific direction. And I suppose it was only natural that half the population of Churchill should have concluded I was a member of a high-grade gang of gold ore thieves attempting to make contact with my fellow conspirators, while the other half thought I was a prospector with knowledge of a secret mine somewhere in the vast interior barrens. Later on, both these theories were discarded in favor of a vastly more intriguing one. When I eventually reestablished contact with Churchill after many months of absence, it was to discover that the nature of my real mission had become public property. I had, so I then learned, actually spent the intervening months floating around the North Pole on an ice floe, keeping tabs on the activities of a crowd of Russians who were drifting about on their ice floe. I was so elated by the realization that I had not only located a pair of wolves, but by an incredible stroke of fortune had found their den as well, that I forgot all caution and ran to a nearby knoll in order to gain a better view of the den mouth. The male wolf, who had been loafing about the foot of the esker after the departure of his wife, instantly saw me. In 3 or 4 bounds, he reached the ridge of the esker, where he stood facing me in an attitude of tense and threatening vigilance. As I looked up at him, my sense of exhilaration waned rapidly. He no longer seemed like a playful pup, but had metamorphosed into a magnificent engine of destruction, which impressed me so much that the neck of my flask positively rattled against my teeth. I decided I had better not disturb the wolf family anymore that day, for fear of upsetting them and perhaps forcing them to move away. So I withdrew. It was not an easy withdrawal, for one of the many difficult things I know of is to walk backward up a broken rocky slope for 3/4 of a mile, encumbered as I was by the complex hardware of a scientist's trade. When I reached the ridge from which I had first seen the wolves, I took a last quick look through the binoculars. The female was still invisible, and the male had so far relaxed his attitude of vigilance as to lie down on the crest of the esker. While I watched, he turned around 2 or 3 times, as a dog will, and then settled himself, nose under tail, with the evident intention of having a nap. I was much relieved to see he was no longer interested in me, for it would have been a tragedy if my accidental intrusion had unduly disturbed these wolves, thereby prejudicing what promised to be a unique opportunity to study the beasts I had come so far to find. As I grew more completely attuned to their daily round of family life, I found it increasingly difficult to maintain an impersonal attitude toward the wolves. No matter how hard I tried to regard them with scientific objectivity, I could not resist the impact of their individual personalities. Because he reminded me irresistibly of a royal gentleman for whom I worked as a simple soldier during the war, I found myself calling the father of the family George, even though in my notebooks he was austerely identified only as Wolf A. George was a massive and eminently regal beast whose coat was silver white. He was about 1/3 larger than his mate, but he hardly needed this extra bulk to emphasize his air of masterful certainty. George had presence. His dignity was unassailable, yet he was by no means aloof. Conscientious to a fault, thoughtful of others, and affectionate within reasonable bounds, he was the kind of father whose idealized image appears in many wistful books of human family reminiscences, but whose real prototype has seldom paced the earth upon 2 legs. George was, in brief, the kind of father every son longs to acknowledge as his own. His wife was equally memorable, a slim, almost pure white wolf with a thick ruff around her face and wide-spaced, slightly slanted eyes. She seemed the picture of a minx. Beautiful, ebullient, passionate to a degree, and devilish when the mood was on her. She hardly looked like the epitome of motherhood, yet there could have been no better mother anywhere. I found myself calling her Angeline, although I have never been able to trace the origin of that name in the murky depths of my own subconscious. I respected and liked George very much, but I became deeply fond of Angeline and still live in hopes that I can somewhere find a human female who embodies all her virtues. Thank you. Back to you, Father William. And Claire, thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, wonderful. Wow. I know there's something about good writing that, I don't know, you just feel like you're right there.
It sure
You're just right present there. Like you just brought it alive, Garrett. I mean, you're just sort of up there looking and experiencing the whole world.
Well, that's what good writing is supposed to do. And good reading, I might add,
Yeah, right, right.
makes a big difference.
Plus I don't know, they talk about writing and about books about really helping people develop empathy.
Yes.
And so, I mean, there's empathy for the natural world, for the wolves, for the, we're so lost. So anyway, extraordinary. Never cry wolf. So on to the fourth reading, and it's about this boat that wouldn't float.
The boat who wouldn't float.
Who wouldn't float?
Is the name of it. And once again, this is a story that has some funny parts to it. Farley did own this boat, and I have to tell you that I have a personal interest in this book because it's through that boat that I met Farley.
Okay.
I was a student of French at Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, which Peter knows well. He's been there too. And Farley was there, not studying as I was. He was there trying to get his boat repaired.
Mm.
And the afternoon that I went down to the harbor to draw the harbor, very picturesque, boats and wharves and things. He came down from his boat, which is high up on what do you call, where they ramp boats up.
Right.
And he said, it's about to be relaunched because the repairs are done. And he said, would you like to come? And we'll be sailing around the harbor a few times. And I said, yes, I would. And I won't. I don't want to tell you the rest.
Well,
of
the rest
story.
of the story.
It went on for 50 years.
50 years after the marriage that would float.
I hope so. Yeah.
So Peter Kedwell, who's, you might introduce yourself, Peter, about some of the connection you have with the boat that wouldn't float.
Thank you, Father William. Thank you, Claire, for asking me to read a excerpt from The Boat Who Wouldn't Float. The first 3 years of my career in education, I taught in Canada's North, specifically in Newfoundland and Labrador, and more particularly in Goose Bay, Labrador for 2 years. And it was in the second year of my return to Goose that I was asked to take on 5 French classes and 1 English. And I didn't know that that was going to be asked of me until I returned. So I spent a good amount of time getting ready for that opening day. And the 2 of us that were teaching English that year decided that, okay, we're going to do something of Newfoundland and Labrador lore, and The Boat Who Wouldn't Float was an obvious choice.
There you go.
So let us start. Amongst the attitudes I acquired from my father was a romantic and Conradian predilection for the sea and ships. Like him, I had often found surcease from the miseries I brought upon myself by spending hours immersed in books about the cruises of small boats to far distant corners of the oceanic world. 10 years before the day of the auction, I had anchored myself to a patch of eroded sandhills in central Ontario, about as far from the sea as a man could get. There I had labored to make grass, trees, vegetables, and my own self take root. My labors had been in vain. Drought killed the grass, sawflies and rabbits gindled the trees, wireworms ate the vegetables. Far from rooting me into the good earth, a decade of servitude to the mingy soil only served to fuel a spirit of rebellion, the intensity of which I had not begun to suspect until I stood in the old ship chandler's store, physically surrounded by a world I had only previously known in the imagination. It happens that I have a friend who is a publisher and who feels much the same way about the book business as I do about dirt farming. Jack McClellan is a romantic, although he blanches at the word and vehemently denies it. During the war, he served as skipper of MTBs, motor torpedo boats. and other such small and dashing craft. And although he returned at war's end to the drabness of the business world, his spirit remained on the bridge of an NTB, streaking through the gray Atlantic wastes, guns blazing at the dim specters of the German E-boats, hopelessly trying to evade their fates. We decided we should do things the old-fashioned way. We both have something of the Drake and Nelson complex. And this meant buying an old-fashioned boat, the kind of wooden boat that once was sailed by iron men. The only place we knew where such a boat might be procured was in the remote and foggy island of Newfoundland. We spent 5 days waiting for good weather before reaching the conclusion that to wait was vain. Good weather and Trepassey did not go together. So early on the 6th day, we cast off our lines, started the Bulgin, and steamed off into the fog. We now had a definite destination in mind, if not in view. We had given up our original intention of sailing to the tropics because it was clear from a scrutiny of our log that even if we maintained our current rate of progress, it would take us 16 months to reach the Caribbean, 29 months to reach the Azores, and 7.5 years to reach the Pacific. We did not have that much time. Consequently, we chose as our alternative the island of Saint-Pierre. It was a foreign land, flying the French flag. It was, and remains, famous for having the cheapest and most abundant supply of alcohol to be found anywhere on or near the North American continent. But perhaps Saint-Pierre's greatest attraction for us was that it lay no more than 120 miles to the westward of Trepassey, and only a few miles off the south coast of Newfoundland. We felt we had at least a chance of reaching Saint-Pierre before winter closed in upon us. Visibility in Trepassey Harbor itself was surprisingly good as we set out. We almost saw the fish plant, and we certainly knew where it was because the wind was blowing from it to us. Once, as we thundered through the harbor channel, we caught an indistinct glimpse of land off the port bow. It may have been Powell's Head, the entry landmark. If so, it was the last landmark we were to see for a long time to come. Trepassey Bay was black with fog. We'd gone no more than a mile when, faint heart that I am, I decided it would be hopeless to proceed. Jack, I said firmly as I could, we'll have to put back to harbor. There isn't a chance we're going to find Saint-Pierre in fog like this. Considering the state of that bleeding compass, we're more likely to end up in Ireland instead. Jack fixed me with a cold stare, and there was no mistaking the threat of mutiny in his voice. He vanished, and I was alone in my thoughts. I had to admit he had a point. Although we had found Trepassey Harbor once in heavy fog, we weren't likely to be as lucky a second time. And the rocks and reefs on both sides of the entrance were particularly fearsome and unforgiving. It so happened that as a part of our life-saving gear, we carried a flare pistol of wartime vintage. I jumped below and got the gun. As the next pass the pilot made, I fired a flare 2 feet above his cabin roof. He sheared off so violently that he heeled his port gunnels underwater. He did not return, but ran at full throttle toward the harbor entrance and disappeared behind the mole. That was undoubtedly one of the most satisfying exploits of my entire nautical career. But it has to be admitted, it was not necessarily the wisest. When half an hour later, we puttered through the gap between the moles and opened the harbor itself, the first thing we saw was a platoon of gendarmes marshaling on the government wharf. The aftermath of that imbroglio might have been unpleasant had not luck been with us. As we galumphed slowly down the channel, we met a large seagoing dory inward bound. Her name, Oregon, was written large across her bows, and I recognized both her and the skipper. He was Théophile Dutchevery, descendant of generations of Basque fishermen who had lived on the islands during the last 300 years. Théo was great, bull-voiced, vibrant man, a power on the islands, and also, thank the Lord, a friend of mine from a previous visit to Saint-Pierre. Théo recognized me too. His bellow of welcome was perfectly audible above the roar of both of our engines. He ran Oregon alongside of us with such abandon that Happy Adventure still bears the scars. Farley, by Christ, you come back to Saint-Pierre at last. C'est bon, c'est magnifique. And in your own bateau you come. Oui, Théophile, I said when I could get a word in edgewise. I've come, but je ne pense pas that I'll be staying long. Regardez-vous astern, with which I pointed to the pursuing flotilla, rapidly closing in upon us. At this point, Mike took a hand. He explained the whole situation, and when Théo got through laughing like a mad walrus, he leapt aboard and instructed me to stop my engine. We were soon surrounded by the Saint-Pierre Home Defense Squadron, and for a while, all was pure pandemonium. When things sorted themselves out, we returned to the harbor with Théo at the tiller of the Happy Adventure, with the rest of the fleet giving us a cheerful escort. It's a nice characteristic of the Saint-Pierre that although they are quick to flame, they are also quick to forgive. Precisely on the hour, Martin, as chef de protocole, mounted to the top of the cabin of Paulo's boat. The local Basque musical group, clad in traditional costumes, sounded a fanfare. Martin made a charming little speech in French and in Basque. When he finished, he turned to Madame Dutchevery, who had been chosen to be godmother to the vessel, and invited her to do her duty. She did it with a will, swinging a ribbon-tethered bottle of Isaro with such enthusiasm that the bottle missed the vessel's bows, snapped its ribbon, soared over our decks, and shattered against the mainmast 10 feet above our heads. Then Saint-Pierre paid tribute to our little ship. Vessel horns and sirens sounded and reverberated across the harbor. And somewhat delayed because of trouble with his quick match, Paulo fired his cannon. The party had two major results. One was that we decided to sail Itchy on a ceremonial voyage to the Basque stronghold of Miquelon. Itchy, this diminutive name, was bestowed on her that night when even the Basque speakers began having trouble pronouncing her name. The other was the signing on of a new crew member in the person of a golden-haired young fugitive from Toronto by the name of Claire, who had come to spend a month on the islands in order to perfect her command of the French language. It was not long before I persuaded her to include in her studies a course in advanced English, with myself as her instructor. Happy birthday, Farley. Thank you, Claire and William. And thank you to all of you watching tonight.
Okay.
Wow. The romance began.
It did indeed. That's where it happened.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I was thinking, he's sort of like an everyman, but he's also like an everywhere. This Farley seems to just be global.
Yes, he pursued all sorts of things. I mean, apart from sailing to Saint-Pierre, he studied wolves, and he was concerned about native people, and he just spanned a whole range of things in the 93 years that he lived.
And testament to him that his books were translated into so many languages, and
Yes,
people
indeed.
around the world listening and reading and thinking.
They have. I've got volumes of them at home in languages like Korean and Bulgarian and things I can't read at all, but I do own some funny looking books.
Okay, well, thank you all. And so now we come to this fifth and final reading. and I'm honored to read it. But Claire, how did you choose this? Just because I was the vicar, you thought I would preach
Well,
a sermon?
no, not exactly that, but I wanted you to be among the readers because you have a very good voice. I just felt that this was a good book to have at the end of these readings because it has a distinct message that about the earth and all that we must do. Don't forget, at the time it was published, there hadn't been a lot said
Right.
yet about the environment. The environment's a word that we've heard too often, but the world itself, the natural world and the way we live in it. And Farley was very concerned about that, and that's why he wrote this book. And by the way, later in the book, he interviews a number of other people
Yes,
who aren't concerned with it. But tonight, you're just going to read the beginning.
yes, good. Yes, it's called, people can see that, Rescue the Earth, Conversations with Green Crusaders. And actually Wade Rowland, who's here in Port Hope and a part of St. Mark's, helped in 1990 put this together. And you're right, it describes and interviews all kinds of interesting people like this Elizabeth May and David Suzuki
Mhm.
and Marty Hummel. Where was Paul Watson? Was he around? I guess maybe he wasn't around.
I don't think he's in there.
No,
is
he's not in
he?
here.
No, no.
Anyway, this, as you said, is the first chapter, Resisting the Juggernaut, is the chapter as he introduces the book. And here's the words of Farley. I can actually hear his voice.
Good.
I'm hoping
Good.
it's
That's
right.
a good sign.
Almost all young children have a natural affinity for other animals, an attitude which seems to be endemic in young creatures of whatever species. And I was no exception. As a child, I fearlessly and happily consorted with frogs and snakes, chickens, squirrels, and whatever else came my way. As a boy, growing up in the Saskatchewan prairies, that feeling of affinity persisted, but then it became perverted. Under my father's tutelage, I was taught to be a hunter, taught to be in communion with nature, could be achieved over the barrel of a gun, taught that killing wild animals for sport establishes a mystic bond between them and us somehow. It was a cold November, and my father and I were crouched in a muddy pit at the edge of a prairie slough called Wakaw Lake, just waiting for daybreak. The dawn, when it came at last, was gray and somber. The sky lightened so imperceptibly that we could hardly detect the coming of the morning. We strained our eyes into the swirling snow squalls and suddenly heard the sound of wings. The cold was forgotten. We crouched lower and flexed numb fingers in our shooting gloves. My father saw them first. He nudged me sharply and half turned my head to behold a spectacle of incomparable grandeur. Out of the storm scud, like ghostly ships, 100 whistling swans bore down upon us in their stately wings. They passed directly overhead, not half a gunshot from us, and I was suddenly transported beyond time and space by a vision of unparalleled majesty and mystery. For one flashing instant, I felt that they and I were one. Then they were gone, and the snow eddies obscured my straining vision. After that, it would not have mattered to me if we had seen no other living thing that day or fired a single shot. But the swans were only the forerunners of multitudes. The windy silence was soon pierced by the sonorous cries of seemingly endless flocks of geese that drifted wraith-like overhead. They were flying low that day, so we could see them clearly. Snow geese, startlingly white of breast, with jet black wingtips, beat past while flocks of piebald wavies kept station on their flanks. An immense V of Canadas came close behind. As the rush of air through their great pinions sounded in our ears, we jumped up and in an action that was more of a conditioned reflex than a conscious one, we raised our guns. The honkers veered directly toward us and we fired. The sound of the shots seemed puny and was lost at once in that immensity of winds and wings. It was pure mischance that one of the great geese was hit, for as we admitted to each other later, neither of us had aimed at them. Nevertheless, one fell, appearing gigantic in the tenuous light as it spiraled sharply down. It struck the water 100 yards from shore, and I saw with sick dismay that it had only been winged. It began to swim off into the growing storm, its neck outstretched, calling, calling, calling after the fast disappearing flock. Driving home to Saskatoon that night, I felt a sick repugnance for what we had done. But what was of far greater import, I was experiencing a poignant but indefinable sense of loss. I felt, although I could not then have expressed it in words, as if I had glimpsed another and quite magical world, a world of oneness, and had been denied entry into it through my own stupidity. I never hunted for sport again. I know that these experiences, together with some others shared with the wolves, the caribou, and the barren land Inuit, brought me to my first conscious awareness of just how far modern men have distanced themselves from the world that gave us birth, and which still nurtures other living beings who are indivisibly linked to us. I remembered reading one of Rudyard Kipling's stories in which Baloo, a wise old bear, tells human child Mowgli, who had been adopted into the jungle world by wolves, "We be of one blood, ye and I." I felt that this was true when I read it at the age of 8 or 9. Now I knew it to be true, and I became more and more anxious to bridge the abyss that yawned between. The hideous results of 5 centuries of death dealing on this continent are not to be gainsaid. But there are at least some indications that we may at last be developing the will and the conscience to look beyond our own immediate gratifications and desires. Belatedly, some part of mankind is trying to rejoin the community of living beings from which we have for so long a time been alienating ourselves, and of which we have for so long a time even been the mortal enemy. Evidence of such a return to sanity is not yet to be looked for in the attitudes and actions of the exploiters who dominate this human world. Rather, the emerging signs of sanity are seen in individuals who, revolted by the frightful excesses to which we have subjected animate creation, are now beginning to reject the killer beast which man has become. Banding together with an ever-increasing potency, they are challenging the self-granted license of the vested interests to continue plundering and savaging the living world for policy, profit, or pleasure. Although they are furiously opposed by the old order, they may be slowly gaining ground. It is to this newfound resolution to reassert our indivisibility with life, to recognize the obligations incumbent upon us as the most powerful and deadly species ever to exist, and to begin making amends for the havoc we have wrought, that my own hopes for revival and continuance of life on earth now turn. If we persevere in this new way, we may succeed in making man human at last.
Thank you.
Farley Mowat. We need to hear that.
We do. We do.
We need to read it, and we need to teach to our children. And I'm glad everyone's here tonight to hear the echoes of Farley through these pages and through these words.
Yes, it's a wonderful idea.
So thank you all. But this final summary, you'd just like me to read.
Yes.
Eastern Passage.
That was his very last book. I don't know if he even realized it himself. He went on writing until the day he died. But the last book of his that was published was Eastern Passage, which was a reminiscence of sailing in the Gulf of St. Lawrence with his father. But as part of that book, he had a special page called Thanksgiving. And when I read it, and strangely enough, I didn't realize it was there at the time the book came out. But I did find it, and I thought, well, we really should conclude this reading with that. And I'll ask you to read it.
Thanksgiving by Farley Mowat. With more than 40 books behind me, the time is ripe for paying homage to those at the heart of my life and labors. Helen and Angus Mowat, my parents, who lit the fire and kept it stoked as long as they lived. Peter Davison, poet of note, my editorial mentor and shepherd through almost 4 decades. Jack McClelland, publisher par excellence, who would and did do anything to keep this writer's boat afloat. Claire Mowat, my wife and partner, who has propped me up, goaded me on, and borne with me for half a century. Mary Talbot, unsung amanuensis, who saw to it that I stayed on track and was instrumental in delivering the goods. Susan Renouf, infallible literary midwife and editorial helmsman, who has kept me on course these past 2 decades. And finally, to our dogs, to Albert, Victoria, Lily, Edward, Tom, Millie, and Chester. And to all my friends, human and otherwise, whose existence has made mine possible, and oh, so wonderful. Thanksgiving from Farley Mowat. And a thanks to all of you, all 78 participants from across Canada. We thank you for joining us. We have recorded it, and I think we're going to post it somewhere for those who might have missed it.
Oh, I hope we do.
This is a coveted time. And to Phil Redford and Pat Bryan and Gary Potter and Peter Kedwell, thank you for taking the time to read and bring Farley alive to us this evening. And for Robert for on the technical side, and for everyone who's joined in, and for Claire Mowat, we've got a walk tomorrow, 4 o'clock,
Thank you.
our Thursday walk,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about the next 100 years of leading on with the life and legacy that Farley has left us.
And William, some of the comments are very, very good. People were saying to happy birthday, Farley Mowat, and a lot about the stories that were read. So there's a lot of good comments in here.
Excellent. So thank you again. We'll keep it for posterity and legacy. And but wherever you are, God bless, be well, be safe. And thanks be to Farley Mowat for tonight. Happy birthday.